David Chen stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie for the 5th time that morning. His hands were shaking slightly, and he couldn't tell if it was from the 3 cups of coffee he'd already downed or the nerves that had been building up for weeks. Today was the day that could change everything. The navy blue suit hanging in his closet had been his lucky charm back when he had a job. Now, after 3 months of unemployment, it felt more like armor he was putting on, before heading into battle. He pulled it on carefully, making sure every crease was perfect. First impressions mattered, especially when you were desperate. Walking to his small kitchen, David grabbed his phone and checked the time again. 9:15 in the morning. His interview was at 10:30, and the subway ride would take about 40 minutes if everything went smoothly. He had planned to arrive 15 minutes early, just like his father had always taught him. Early is on time is late, and late is unemployed, his dad used to say. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, already unemployed, trying his best not to make it permanent. David looked around his tiny apartment one more time. The place was clean but sparse. He'd sold most of his furniture over the past few months to help pay bills. What remained were the basics: a bed, a small table, 1 chair, and his grandmother's old rocking chair that he couldn't bring himself to sell. The apartment was in a building he owned, which should have made things easier. But owning a small apartment building wasn't the gold mine most people thought it was. After paying for repairs, property taxes, and the mortgage his grandmother had left behind, there wasn't much profit. Certainly not enough to live on without a regular job. The building had 6 units, and while most of his tenants paid on time, the rental income barely covered the expenses. Some months he actually had to pay money out of his own pocket just to keep the place running. When he'd had his marketing job, this wasn't a problem. Now, with his savings running dangerously low, every dollar mattered. David grabbed his keys and wallet, double-checking that he had everything he needed. Resume, references, portfolio of his best work from his previous job, and a small notebook where he'd written down everything he could find about the company he was interviewing with. Sterling and Associates was one of the top consulting firms in the city. Getting a job there would solve all his problems. The salary they'd mentioned over the phone was almost double what he'd been making at his old job. It would mean financial security, a chance to rebuild his savings, and maybe even the opportunity to fix up his building properly. As he walked down the narrow hallway of his building, David noticed how quiet it was. Most of his tenants had already left for work. Mrs. Rodriguez in 3B was probably still asleep. She worked late shifts at a local diner and usually didn't get home until after midnight. Mr. Thompson in 1A had already left for his construction job. The young couple in 2B were both teachers and had been gone since 7:30. David liked being a landlord, even though it was more work than he'd expected. When his grandmother passed away 2 years ago and left him the building, he'd thought it would be simple. Collect rent, fix things when they broke, and enjoy the extra income. Reality had been much more complicated. There were always problems. Leaky faucets, broken heaters, complaints about noise, and the endless paperwork that came with being a property owner. But there were good moments too, like when Mrs. Rodriguez had brought him homemade cookies last Christmas, or when the couple in 2B had invited him to their wedding. The building was old but solid. His grandmother had bought it in the 1970s when the neighborhood was rough and property was cheap. Now the area was getting better, with new restaurants and small businesses moving in. Property values were going up, which was good for David in Maine theory, but also meant higher property taxes. Walking out onto the street, David felt the cool morning air hit his face. It was a perfect fall day, the kind that made you feel like good things were possible. The trees were just starting to change colors, and there was that crisp feeling in the air that made everything seem more alive. He started walking toward the subway station, his mind racing through all the questions they might ask him at the interview. He'd practiced his answers dozens of times, but he still felt nervous. Competition for good jobs was fierce, and he knew there would probably be other candidates just as qualified as he was. The truth was, David had been out of work longer than he'd told anyone. 3 months sounded bad enough. He didn't want to admit that he'd actually been struggling for almost 5 months. The first 2 months he'd been picky about job opportunities, thinking something perfect would come along quickly. Now he knew better. He couldn't afford to be picky anymore. His savings account, which had once made him feel secure, was down to less than $800. That might last him another month if he was very careful about spending. After that, he'd have to start borrowing money, or even worse, consider selling the building. Selling wasn't really an option, though. The building was his only real asset, and it was still worth less than what was owed on the mortgage. His grandmother had taken out a second mortgage a few years before she died to pay for some major repairs. It had seemed like a smart move at the time, but now it meant David was basically underwater on the property. As he walked, David tried to push these worries out of his mind. Today was about moving forward, not dwelling on problems. If he got this job, everything would work out. He'd be able to pay his bills, take better care of his building, and maybe even start planning for the future again. The consulting firm had found his resume online and called him out of the blue 3 weeks ago. The person who called said they were impressed with his background in marketing and thought he might be a good fit for their team. David had been so excited he'd barely slept for 2 days afterward. Since then, he'd researched everything he could about the company. He knew the names of the partners, understood their biggest clients, and had read every article he could find about their recent projects. He was as prepared as anyone could be. David checked his phone again. 9:25. He was making good time. The subway station was just 2 blocks away now. In a little over an hour, he'd be sitting across from potential employers, trying to convince them that he was exactly what their company needed. He took a deep breath and picked up his pace, slightly. Today was going to be a good day. It had to be. He'd worked too hard and prepared too much for it to be anything else. In just a few hours, his whole life might be different. Little did David know that in just a few minutes, he would make a choice that would change not only his life, but the life of someone else in a way he never could have imagined. David was walking at a brisk pace when he saw her. At first, he almost kept going. His mind was focused on the interview, on all the things he needed to remember to say and do. But something about the way she was sitting made him stop. Mrs. Rodriguez was on the front steps of his building, hunched over with her face in her hands. She had a small brown suitcase next to her, the kind people used for overnight trips. Her gray hair was usually neat and tidy, but today it looked messy, like she'd been running her hands through it. Even from a distance, David could tell something was very wrong. He glanced at his watch. 9:32. He still had time to catch his train, but not much time to spare. The smart thing would be to keep walking. Mrs. Rodriguez was a nice lady, but she had family who could help her. He had an interview that could save his financial future, but David's feet seemed to have their own ideas. Instead of continuing toward the subway, he found himself walking back toward the building. As he got closer, he could hear soft crying sounds. Mrs. Rodriguez was definitely upset about something. "Mrs. Rodriguez?" David called out gently. "Are you okay?" The elderly woman looked up, and David was shocked by what he saw. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying. Her usually cheerful face looked exhausted and worried. She was wearing her best dress, the blue one she wore to church on Sundays, but it was wrinkled like she'd been wearing it all night. "Oh, David," she said, trying to wipe her eyes with a tissue. "I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to sit here, I don't know what to do." David sat down on the step next to her, forgetting about his clean suit for a moment. "What's wrong? What happened?" Mrs. Rodriguez took a shaky breath. "It's my grandson, Miguel. He was in a car accident last night. He's in the hospital, and I've been trying to get there since 4 this morning, but I don't know how." David felt his stomach drop. Miguel was Mrs. Rodriguez's pride and joy. He was a good kid, maybe 22 years old, who visited his grandmother every weekend. David had seen him around the building many times, always carrying groceries or helping with something that needed fixing. "Is he okay?" David asked. "How bad was the accident?" "I don't know," Mrs. Rodriguez said, starting to cry again. "The hospital called me at 3 in the morning. They said he was stable but hurt. They said I should come as soon as possible. But David, I don't know how to get there." She pulled out an old flip phone and looked at it helplessly. "Miguel always drives me places or calls those car services on his phone. I tried to call a taxi, but they want cash up front, and I only..." Have $12. I tried to ask my neighbor for help, but no one answered their door. David checked his watch again. 9:35. The hospital Mrs. Rodriguez was talking about was across town, at least a 20-minute drive in the opposite direction from where he needed to go. If he helped her, there was no way he'd make his interview on time. I tried to figure out that ride app thing on Miguel's old phone. Mrs. Rodriguez continued. He left it here last weekend and forgot to take it, but I can't make it work. All these buttons and screens, I just want to see my grandson. She looked so lost and afraid. David had never seen her like this. Mrs. Rodriguez was usually the strongest person in the building. She worked 2 jobs, took care of herself, and never asked anyone for help with anything. Seeing her so vulnerable was heartbreaking. Mrs. Rodriguez, David said slowly, I have a car. I could drive you to the hospital. The moment the words left his mouth, David realized what he was saying. He was offering to give up his interview, the one thing that could solve all his problems, to help someone who didn't even know he was her landlord. Mrs. Rodriguez looked up at him with hope in her eyes. You would do that? But don't you have work today? I don't want to be a burden. David thought about the interview. He thought about the job that could change his life, about his empty bank account, about all the bills he needed to pay. Then he looked at Mrs. Rodriguez's face and realized he didn't really have a choice. Not if he wanted to live with himself. It's okay, he said. Let me just make a quick phone call. David pulled out his phone and found the number for Sterling and Associates. His hands were trembling slightly as he dialed. A receptionist answered on the second ring. Good morning, Sterling and Associates. Hi, this is David Chen. I have an interview scheduled for 10:30 this morning with Mr. Patterson. I'm calling because I have a family emergency and need to reschedule. There was a pause on the other end. Hold on, let me check the schedule. David waited, watching Mrs. Rodriguez clutch her suitcase. She was looking at him with such gratitude that it made his chest feel tight. Mr. Chen? The receptionist came, back on the line. I see your appointment here. Unfortunately, Mr. Patterson has a very busy schedule, and we have several other qualified candidates interviewing for this position. We really can't accommodate rescheduling at such short notice. David felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. I understand this is inconvenient, but this is a real emergency. Could we possibly reschedule for later today or tomorrow? I'm sorry, but that's just not possible. Mr. Patterson is making his final decision by the end of this week. If you can't make today's appointment, we'll have to move forward with our other candidates. David closed his eyes. 3 months of unemployment, dozens of job applications, and this was the only real opportunity he'd had. Now it was slipping away because he couldn't ignore someone in need. I understand, David said quietly. Thank you for your time. He hung up the phone and sat there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. He'd just given up his best chance at financial stability to help a tenant who was behind on her rent and didn't even know he owned the building. What did they say? Mrs. Rodriguez asked softly. David looked at her worried face and made a decision. Don't worry about it. Are you ready to go to the hospital? Mrs. Rodriguez started crying again, but this time it seemed like relief mixed with the worry. David, I can't let you do this. This is too much to ask. You didn't ask, David said, standing up and offering her his hand. I'm offering. Come on, let's go see Miguel. As they walked toward David's car, Mrs. Rodriguez kept thanking him. She had no idea that he'd just given up a job interview that could have solved all his financial problems. She didn't know that. Helping her might put his own future in jeopardy. But as David unlocked his car and helped Mrs. Rodriguez with her suitcase, he realized something important. Some things mattered more than money, and sometimes doing the right thing was more important than doing the smart thing. He just hoped he wouldn't regret this decision when his bills started piling up next month. The drive to the hospital started, in silence. Mrs. Rodriguez sat in the passenger seat, clutching her small suitcase and staring out the window. David could see her hands shaking slightly, and he wasn't sure if it was from worry about Miguel or embarrassment about needing help. Traffic was heavier than David had expected. Every red light felt like it lasted forever, and he found himself gripping the steering wheel tighter with each delay. Not because he was in a hurry anymore, but because he could feel Mrs. Rodriguez's anxiety filling the car like a thick fog. "Tell me about Miguel," David said, hoping to distract her from her worries. "How is he doing in school?" Mrs. Rodriguez's face softened a little. "He's such a good boy, David. He's in his last year of college, studying to be a teacher. He wants to work with kids who have learning disabilities like he did when he was young." She reached into her purse and pulled out a worn photo. It showed a young man with a bright smile, wearing a graduation cap and gown. "This is from when he finished community college 2 years ago. He was so proud. His parents died when he was 15, you know. Car accident, just like..." She stopped talking and put the photo away quickly. David felt a chill run down his spine. No wonder she was so scared. Miguel was all the family she had left, and now he was in the hospital after a car accident, just like his parents had been. "He's going to be okay," David said, though he had no way of knowing if that was true. "The hospital said he was stable, right?" Mrs. Rodriguez nodded. "Yes, but stable could mean anything. I've watched enough medical shows to know that. And they said I should come as soon as possible." "That doesn't sound good, does it?" David didn't know how to answer that. He'd never been in a situation like this before. When his grandmother had been sick, it was different. She'd been old and had been declining for months. This was sudden, unexpected, and involved someone young who had his whole life ahead of him. As they sat at another red light, Mrs. Rodriguez started talking again. "Miguel comes to see me every Saturday. He brings groceries and helps me with things around the apartment. Last weekend, he fixed my kitchen faucet and helped me rearrange my furniture so I could reach things better." She paused, looking down at her hands. "I don't know what I'd do without him, David. He's the only family I have left, and lately, things have been so hard." David glanced over at her. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment. David thought she might not answer, but then she started talking in a voice so soft he had to strain to hear her. "I haven't been able to work as much as I used to. My arthritis has been getting worse, and standing for long shifts at the diner is getting harder every week. Some days my hands hurt so bad I can barely hold the coffee pot." David felt something heavy settle in his stomach. He'd noticed that Mrs. Rodriguez looked tired lately, but he'd assumed it was just because she worked nights. He had no idea she was struggling with health problems. "My other job is cleaning offices downtown," she continued. "I do that 3 mornings a week, but last month, they cut my hours because business was slow. Now I'm only working 2 mornings, and the diner cut my shifts from 4 nights to 3. She was telling him that she was working less, which meant earning less money. David's mind immediately went to the rent situation. As her landlord, he knew she'd been late with payments lately, but he'd assumed it was just temporary. Now he was learning there were serious reasons behind it. "I've been trying to find another job," Mrs. Rodriguez said, "but who wants to hire a 78-year-old woman, especially one whose hands shake sometimes and who can't lift heavy things anymore?" They finally reached the hospital parking lot. David found a spot close to the entrance and turned off the engine. Mrs. Rodriguez sat there for a moment, not moving. "David," she said quietly, "I need to tell you something. I'm behind on my rent." David's heart started beating faster. He wanted to tell her that he knew that he was her landlord, but something stopped him. She needed to get this off her chest. "I owe 3 months' rent," she continued. "I keep meaning to call the property management company to explain, but I'm scared they'll just tell me to move out. I've never been late with rent in my life, not once in the 40 years I've been renting apartments." Her voice was getting more emotional. "I don't even know who owns the building. All my rent payments go to that management company downtown. For all I know, my landlord is some rich person who doesn't care about tenants like me." David felt like he'd been hit by lightning. Here was Mrs. Rodriguez, worried sick about her grandson, telling him about her financial struggles and her fear of being evicted, and she had no idea that the person she was confessing to was the very landlord she was afraid to contact. "I'm sure your landlord would understand," David said carefully, "if you explained the situation." Mrs. Rodriguez shook her head. "You don't know how these things work, David. Landlords don't care about sob stories, they care about getting their money on time. If you can't pay, they find someone who can. She picked up her suitcase and opened the car door. But I can't worry about that right now. I need to see Miguel. As they walked toward the hospital entrance, David's mind was racing. He felt guilty for not telling her who he really was. But this wasn't the right time or place. She was already dealing with enough stress. The hospital lobby was busy and confusing. There were multiple information desks, elevators going in different directions, and signs pointing to various departments. Mrs. Rodriguez looked around with wide eyes, clearly overwhelmed. "Excuse me," David said to a woman at the information desk. "We're looking for Miguel Rodriguez. He was brought in last night after a car accident." The woman typed something into her computer. "Miguel Rodriguez, 22 years old?" "Yes, that's him," Mrs. Rodriguez said quickly. "He's in the intensive care unit on the 4th floor. You'll need to check in at the ICU desk. Visiting hours are limited and only immediate family members are allowed." David felt Mrs. Rodriguez grab his arm. Intensive care? They didn't tell. He was in intensive care. The elevator ride to the 4th floor felt like it took forever. Mrs. Rodriguez was quiet again, but David could see the fear growing in her eyes. Intensive care sounded much more serious than stable condition. When the elevator doors opened, they were greeted by the sounds and smells of a busy hospital unit. Machines beeping, nurses walking quickly between rooms, and that antiseptic smell that made everything feel cold and sterile. David realized that his expensive suit and his missed job interview suddenly seemed very unimportant. All that mattered now was helping Mrs. Rodriguez get through whatever they were about to learn about Miguel's condition. The ICU waiting room was unlike any place David had ever been. Families sat in small clusters, some crying quietly, others staring at their phones or at nothing at all. The overhead lights were too bright, and the chairs were the kind that looked comfortable, but made your back ache after sitting for more than a few minutes. Mrs. Rodriguez had been talking to the nurse. At the desk for what felt like forever, David watched as she pulled out various forms of identification and answered question after question. Finally, she walked back over to where he was sitting, and her face showed relief mixed with exhaustion. "Miguel is stable," she said, sitting down heavily in the chair next to David. "He has a broken leg, some bruised ribs, and a concussion. They want to keep him for observation for at least 2 more days, but the doctor thinks he's going to be fine." David felt like he could breathe again. "That's wonderful news. When can you see him?" "In about an hour. They're doing some tests right now, but then I can visit for 30 minutes. After that, visiting hours don't start again until this evening." Mrs. Rodriguez looked around the waiting room. "I guess I'll be spending the day here." David checked his watch. It was almost noon. His interview would have been over by now. He wondered if the consulting firm had already offered the job to someone else, or if they were still interviewing other candidates. Part of him wanted to call and try to explain again, but he knew it was too late. "You don't have to stay," Mrs. Rodriguez said, noticing him looking at his watch. "You've already done so much for me. I'm sure you have things you need to do." David almost laughed. The biggest thing he'd had to do today was already ruined. "I'm not going anywhere. You shouldn't have to deal with this alone." Over the next few hours, David learned more about Mrs. Rodriguez than he'd learned in the 2 years she'd been his tenant. She told him about growing up in Puerto Rico, about meeting her husband when she was 18 and moving to the mainland with him. She talked about raising 4 children, watching 3 of them move away to different states and losing her youngest son in Afghanistan. "Miguel is my daughter's boy," she explained. "When Rita died in that car accident with her husband, Miguel came to live with me. He was so angry and sad. I didn't know how to help him." She pulled out her phone and showed David more pictures. Miguel at his high school graduation. Miguel volunteering at a local elementary school. Miguel helping her plant flowers in the small garden behind their building. "He turned his life around," she said proudly. "His grades in high school weren't good because he was so upset about losing his parents, but in college he's been getting A's and B's. He wants to help kids who are struggling like he did." As the afternoon wore on, Mrs. Rodriguez became more comfortable talking about her problems. She explained how her husband's medical bills had eaten up most of their savings before he died 5 years ago, how she'd been managing okay until her health started declining and her work hours got cut. The worst part is the shame, she said quietly. I've always been able to take care of myself. I raised 4 kids mostly on my own because my husband traveled for work. I've worked since I was 16 years old. And now, at 78, I can't even pay my rent on time. David's guilt was growing stronger by the hour. Here was this proud, hard-working woman beating herself up for falling behind on rent, and she had no idea she was talking to the person who could solve her problem with a simple conversation. Mrs. Rodriguez, David said carefully, have you tried talking to your landlord about the rent situation? She shook her head. I don't even know how to reach him. Or her. I don't even know if my landlord is a man or woman. Everything goes through that property management company. They send me a bill every month, I pay it, and that's it. She paused and looked around the waiting room. Besides, what would I say? That I'm old and sick and can't work as much as I used to? That's not the landlord's problem. They're running a business, not a charity. David felt sick to his stomach. He thought about all the times over the past few months when he'd wondered why Mrs. Rodriguez's rent was late. He'd been annoyed about it, worried about his own finances, and had even considered asking the property management company to send her a formal notice. Maybe your landlord is more understanding than you think, David said. Mrs. Rodriguez gave him a sad smile. You're sweet, David, but you don't understand how the world works. Landlords don't care about tenants' personal problems. They care about money, and I don't have enough of it. Just then a nurse approached them. Mrs. Rodriguez, Miguel is awake and asking for you. The visit to Miguel's room was emotional. The young man was awake but groggy, with bandages on his head and his leg in a cast. When he saw his grandmother, he started crying, apologizing over and over for scaring her. I was driving home from my study group, Miguel explained. Some guy ran a red light and hit me. I don't remember much after that. Mrs. Rodriguez held his hand and told him not to worry about anything except getting better. She didn't mention her financial problems or her fear about the rent. David watched from the corner of the room, feeling like an intruder but not wanting to leave Mrs. Rodriguez alone. After the visit, they went back to the waiting room. Mrs. Rodriguez seemed more relaxed now that she'd seen Miguel and knew he was going to be okay. But as the afternoon turned into evening, she started worrying about other things. I should call the diner and tell them I can't work tonight, she said. I hate to miss another shift, but I can't leave Miguel. David realized she was choosing between being with her injured grandson and earning money she desperately needed. Call them, he said. Miguel needs you here. As Mrs. Rodriguez made her phone call, David found himself thinking about the building, about the other tenants, about all the assumptions he'd made about people's lives. Mrs. Rodriguez wasn't a bad tenant who didn't care about paying rent on time. She was a woman doing her best in an impossible situation. When she finished her call, Mrs. Rodriguez sat back down next to David. They weren't happy, she said. This is the 3rd shift I've missed in the past month. I think they're going to fire me. She put her head in her hands. I don't know what I'm going to do, David. Miguel needs me here, but I need to work, and I still owe 3 months' rent. Maybe it's time to give up and move somewhere cheaper. David couldn't take it anymore. The weight of keeping his secret was crushing him, and Mrs. Rodriguez was talking about moving away because of a problem he could solve immediately. Mrs. Rodriguez, he said slowly, I need to tell you something important. She looked up at him, with tired eyes. I'm your landlord, David said. I own the building where you live. Mrs. Rodriguez stared at David for what felt like forever. Her mouth was slightly open, and her eyes were wide with shock. The busy sounds of the hospital waiting room seemed to fade away as she processed what he had just told her. You're my landlord? She whispered. David nodded, feeling his heart pound in his chest. I inherited the building from my grandmother 2 years ago. I had no idea you were struggling with the rent until today. Mrs. Rodriguez's face went through several different emotions. First confusion, then embarrassment, and finally what looked like horror. She stood up quickly, almost dropping her purse. Oh my God, David, I've been complaining about my landlord to my landlord all day. I told you I thought you were probably some rich person who didn't care about tenants. She put her hand over her mouth. I'm so embarrassed. Please don't be embarrassed, David said, standing up too. You had no way of knowing. And everything you told me today, it helps me understand what you're going through. Mrs. Rodriguez sat back down slowly, shaking her head. This is why you helped me today, isn't it? Because you felt guilty about the rent. No, David said firmly. I helped you because you needed help. I didn't know who you were when I saw you crying on the steps this morning. I just saw someone who was scared and alone. They sat in silence for a few minutes. Mrs. Rodriguez kept looking at David like she was seeing him for the first time. Finally, she spoke again. Are you going to evict me? She asked quietly. David felt like his heart was breaking. Mrs. Rodriguez, I would never evict you. We're going to figure out the rent situation together. Maybe we can work out a payment plan, or maybe there are programs that can help with your rent. I can't accept charity, Mrs. Rodriguez said, her voice getting stronger. I've worked my whole life. I don't want handouts. It's not charity, David explained. You're a good tenant who's going through a hard time. Good landlords work with good tenants. That's just good business. Over the next hour, they talked about practical solutions. David learned that Mrs. Rodriguez qualified for several assistance programs that she didn't know existed. He also realized that the rent he was charging was actually below market rate for the area, which meant she was getting a good deal even when she could pay the full amount. I have an idea, David said. What if you helped me with some property management tasks in exchange for a rent reduction? You know all the tenants. You're home during the day and you notice when things need to be fixed. Mrs. Rodriguez looked interested. What kind of tasks? Collecting rent from other tenants, doing small maintenance checks, maybe helping coordinate repairs when I'm at work. I've been doing everything myself, but I could really use help from someone who knows the building. For the first time all day, Mrs. Rodriguez smiled. I would like that. I know that building better than anyone. I've lived there for 8 years. As evening turned into night, they took turns visiting Miguel. The young man was doing much better, and the doctors said he could probably go home in 2 days. Mrs. Rodriguez was relieved, but she was also worried about how Miguel would manage with his broken leg. He lives in a third-floor apartment with no elevator, she explained to David, and he'll need help getting around for at least 6 weeks. David had another idea. What about the storage room on the first floor of our building? It's big enough to be a temporary bedroom. Miguel could stay there while he recovers, and you could take care of him easily. Mrs. Rodriguez started crying again, but this time they were happy tears. David, you've already done so much for us, I can't ask you to do more. You're not asking, David said. I'm offering. Besides, Miguel seems like a good kid. Maybe he can help out with building maintenance once he's feeling better. 3 months later, David's life looked completely different than he had expected. He still didn't have a job at the consulting firm, but he had found something better. Word had spread in the neighborhood about how he had helped Mrs. Rodriguez, and other property owners started asking him for advice about tenant relations. Miguel had recovered fully from his accident and was indeed helpful with building maintenance. He had also introduced David to some of his college professors who were impressed by David's story. One of them worked part-time as a consultant for nonprofit organizations and offered David a freelance project. The project was helping a nonprofit develop a program to prevent elderly evictions by improving communication between landlords and tenants. It paid well, and more importantly, it led to other similar projects. David discovered he had a talent for solving problems and bringing people together. Mrs. Rodriguez became David's unofficial property manager, and she was excellent at it. She knew every tenant's story, anticipated problems before they became serious, and had a way of making everyone feel heard and valued. The other tenants loved her, and David's building became known as one of the friendliest places to live in the neighborhood. The biggest surprise came 4 months after the hospital incident. David got a call from someone at Sterling & Associates, the consulting firm where he had missed his interview. Mr. Chen, this is Patricia Williams from Sterling & Associates. I know this might seem strange, but we'd like to schedule an interview with you. David was confused. I thought that position was filled months ago. It was, Patricia explained, but we have a new client who specifically requested to work with you. They heard about your work in tenant relations and community building. Apparently, one of our client's employees told them an amazing story about a landlord who missed a job interview to help an elderly tenant get to the hospital. It turned out that Miguel's cousin worked at a company that contracted with Sterling and Associates. He had told the story of David's kindness to his boss, who was so impressed that he wanted David to help develop a corporate social responsibility program. The project with Sterling and Associates led to a full-time consulting position that paid even better than the original job David had missed. But more than that, it was work that felt meaningful. He was helping companies find ways to support their communities and treat people with dignity. On the one-year anniversary of the hospital incident, David and Mrs. Rodriguez were sitting in the small garden behind their building. Miguel was there, too, fully recovered and just a few months away from graduating college. He had already been offered a job at a local school working with kids who had learning disabilities. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had gone to that interview instead of helping me?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked. David thought about it. "Sometimes, but I think I ended up exactly where I was supposed to be." Mrs. Rodriguez smiled. "Miguel and I were talking about this the other day. We think you were an angel sent to help us, but really, we were angels sent to help you find your true calling." David laughed. "Maybe we were all just people who needed each other at the right time." As the sun set behind their building, David realized that the best decisions in life often feel like the scariest ones when you're making them. Sometimes, missing the thing you think you want leads you to the thing you actually need.